Dennis Galecki. Welcome to the 439th Imagine Greater Buffalo program and another virtual Imagine lecture, our 61st, hosted by our wonderful Buffalo and Erie County Public Library. Thanks so much for joining us today as we celebrate Native American Heritage Month. This program is created by ImagineLifelongLearning.com and the Center for the Study of Art, Architecture, History, and Nature, whose mission is to explore life's ancient aesthetic values, beauty, truth, goodness, and justice as part of the Buffalo Chautauqua idea. Now, we're going to start with our speaker shortly, but first, a little housekeeping. Everyone watching will be muted during our speaker's presentation. So if you do have a question, please type it into the chat box and we'll get to as many as we can. This program is being recorded, so you'll be able to watch it again later on the Downtown Central Library's Facebook page and YouTube channels. And we hope you share the link with your friends and networks. Now, our featured speaker today is Hayden Haynes. He's stepping in for Joe Stallman, who had a conflict, and we've rescheduled Joe, the executive director of the museum that you'll be hearing about. He's been rescheduled for February of next year. Hayden Haynes is from the Onöhsagwë or Seneca Nation. Currently, he serves as the museum manager at the Seneca-Iroquois National Museum for the Seneca Nation in Salamanca, New York. Hayden has been part of the museum since the opening of the Onöhsagwë Cultural Center in 2018. Previously to the museum, Hayden worked in a number of service-oriented industries. His specialty is performing special events. Hayden is an award-winning antler carver. He is deeply involved in the revitalization of the ancient art form of antler and bone carving. His goal is to get this culturally and historically relevant medium out to a larger audience, which he hopes to inspire others to carry on the tradition. Regularly, Hayden teaches the techniques related to this challenging medium and enjoys presenting on the education importance of the material and art as it relates to the Haudenosaunee. Hayden currently serves on the Tri-County Art Council's Board of Directors and is a member of the Native Roots Artist Guild. Hayden is also going to help us pronounce correctly words that I've done my best to express. So let's give a warm welcome here to Hayden Haynes. Hayden, welcome aboard. Let's hear from you.
Thank you, Dennis. Yeah, no, I think you did a great job. Thanks for the effort with the pronunciation of the words. Onöhsagwë, that's what our people refer ourselves to in terms of the what others refer to us as Seneca. Onöhsagwë means people of the Great Hill. So more oftentimes than not nowadays, our people prefer to use that term to describe who we are, since the word Seneca doesn't necessarily mean anything to us. But thank you for having me. The Onöhsagwë Cultural Center is a new building, and I'd like to talk to you a little bit about how we got to this point today. Next slide, please. So before we talk about the cultural center, we're going to talk about how we got to this point. So initially, it started off as a museum. In 1977, the museum opened its doors to a crowd of several hundred folks. Representatives from all the 6 nations had come down, as well as, local legislators and et cetera. It was a much smaller building, 80 foot by 80 foot, and it cost about $190,000. At that time, the collections for the museum, which was just beginning, was not even at the museum itself. It was down the street across town on Rochester Street. And until the old museum closed and moved over here to the new cultural center, that is where the collections had always been. It was in a separate building. So it was a much smaller space, but it was the inception of what we now know as the Onöhsagwë Cultural Center. Next slide, please. So in August 4th is when the new building opened, and that's where we're at today. So as you can see there, it costs quite a significant lot of more money, and it has a much bigger space. It also has an outdoor amphitheater, which can seat up to like 400 people. We have a lot of special events out there in an outdoor amphitheater. Our annual Heritage Day Festival, that usually happens in June, is held in our outdoor amphitheater. The collections is now under the same building roof of the Onöhsagwë Cultural Center. What's neat about the architecture of the cultural center is, and you can't see it in that photo, but the collections is not underground. It's in our basement, we call it, but it's not necessarily underground. So what happens is the building slopes downward. It's sort of cut into the hill where that front of the building is. You can see in that rendering. So that's because like our cultural artifacts and our ancient materials are not supposed to be buried. Once they're unearthed, they should not be put. Some of those things are not supposed to be put back into the ground. So that's why our collection is a sort of cut into that hill, and so that way it's not necessarily back underground again. It's sort of like sloping inward into the building. Next slide, please. So I'll go back to the pronunciation, Onöhsagwë. So that's actually the name of one of our local community members. His English name was Richard Johnny John. So he was born, in 1914, and the name of his, the meaning of his name, I should say, is actually sort of translates to a house or a dwelling or a building with two openings on it. So it's kind of interesting because Onöhsagwë, or as many of the people that knew him well sort of just called him Gwande. What's interesting about not only what he's done for our people, but the meaning of his name. So before I get into that, I want to acknowledge some of the things that he did for our people. In our longhouse, for lack of a better words, religion, he was the head faith keeper, right? So that's very important. So he's deeply involved in our ceremonies and what have you. He was also a lead dancer, and he was a speaker in the longhouse as well, right? So he was a language teacher. He taught language in like the local community, like daycare centers, because he felt it was important to revitalize our culture and language. And he did that through performances. Nowadays, oftentimes, if you go to a Native American or more specifically like a Haudenosaunee festival or an art gathering or something like that, oftentimes you'll see social dancing by, a troupe of men and women who are dressed in traditional regalia, and there's usually a singer, and they perform songs, social dance songs, and that's pretty common nowadays. But back in the day of Mr. Johnny John, he was one of the pioneers that started doing that stuff, traveling around with his dance troupe, I guess if you want to call it that, and performing for people to hope to educate folks and keep our culture and history alive. So in addition to that, as a teacher and someone who spoke fluent Seneca language, he also felt it necessary to help teach it. So he did what he could to teach it to our children in the community. And he was a volunteer fireman on our territory as well. So massive contributions to our people. So to honor him, the building was named after him. So his name sort of means, this is the interesting part, his name sort of means something like a building, and the building is named after him. So that's kind of interesting that it kind of happened that way. And so we're very happy to use our language in our name of the cultural center, right? Because it's something important. It does present challenges at times, especially if people are trying to find the building, you know, or trying to ask maybe for directions, right? Where do I get to this building, right? We don't know how to say it. So we've met with some challenges, but you know what? It's important that I feel, you know, we continue to use our language more. And that was one of the initiatives that Mr. Johnny John was a part of. Next slide, please. So now that we have this beautiful new building with a lot more space, not only is the Seneca-Iroquois National Museum a part of this building, it is now just one department as opposed to the sole department in the old structure. So now we have the Seneca-Iroquois National Museum, the Tribal Historic Preservation Office, the Seneca Nation Archives Department, and now the collections. And the reason that the collections has an asterisk is because our collections is so big at this point that it's almost becoming its own department. So these are actual departments under the umbrella of the Seneca Nation of Indians. And that's what's you know, important to highlight here, is that a lot of museums, et cetera, are not owned by Native peoples, and this is one of the few ones that actually is, and it's operated by Haudenosaunee people. So everybody that works here is a member of the Haudenosaunee nations, one of the 6. So that's an interesting part of it too. So now in this big building, we have all these different departments that are coming together into this one giant cultural center. And I think it's a great thing for the Seneca Nation, because we're right here on the Allegheny territory, which is one of our 3 territories under the Seneca Nation of Indians. And it's right off I-86. So it's sort of like, I guess, you know, the face of the Seneca Nation. This is an important place where people can come to the Seneca-Iroquois National Museum, learn about our history, and also, you know, visit our archives for research, visit our collections for research. And so in that aspect, it's a much needed step forward as we move forward. Next slide, please. So first, I'd like just to talk about the museum. We have, you know, several community members who are on our staff, as I mentioned, who are Haudenosaunee people. We give guided tours. Sometimes and that's what's cool about our museum too, is that we give tours to children, adults, and we even have specialty tours that we've developed. You know, the director, Dr. Joe Stallman, has been very instrumental in creating these really in-depth tours that can be sort of crafted to fit needs. And these workshops that we've started doing over the past year related to cultural sensitivity, but not just in the generic sense, much more tailored to as it relates to the history of our people, but also how we are today and what those effects have sort of had, because those are living, breathing things, right? It's not events that happened in the past still exist today within our people, and there's still challenges that we face. And so those cultural sensitivity trainings have been pretty successful. Special events, as I mentioned before, we have our annual Heritage Day Festival. That's our biggest event of the year. It usually happens in June. It's usually an outside event, weather permitting. And we started this annual event called the Winter Art Market, and that happens in November. It's actually next week, November 27th. It's a Saturday. It's always free. It's always open to the public. We have native vendors come in where people can, you know, shop with the native vendors and talk with them and learn about what they do. This year, we're having an exhibition opening about the Thomas Indian School, which was a residential boarding school on our Cattaraugus territory. So that's a big event as well. And then we also have a guest lecture and a smaller exhibition opening by Dr. Rodney Herring, who is also an Onöhsagwë man, and he's going to unveil his story stick collection. So he's created these lacrosse stick artworks, and he's going to unveil and discuss them with the community during that day, and that's going to happen at 12 p.m. So this year's Winter Art Market has got a little bit more educational components as opposed to just the shopping aspect that we've sort of done in the past. We have a museum store, both online and in-store. You can connect with our online museum store through our website, senecamuseum.org. And exhibitions. So we have some permanent exhibitions, of course, but we have spaces and other areas where we can rotate new exhibitions out every 6 months. Some are shorter, even 3 months. And then we have ones that go for like about a year. Next slide, please. And then we have our Tribal Historic Preservation Office, as I mentioned. And this is an area that Joe really, because he's the director of the Onöhsagwë Cultural Center, and he works primarily with this type of work. And so, I mean, enough can't be said about the importance of the preservation of the sites and the materials and the maybe human remains that get found, and also, you know, to create the community initiatives that THPO supports. So, for example, it's this week, we have a finger weaving class that THPO is supporting at the Cultural Center. Finger weaving is a art and a craft practice that, you know, is not a lot of people can do, but there's a few people in our communities that are experts at it, and we brought in one of those experts in to come and teach some people. So it's a continuation of revitalizing our art forms, and the THPO helps support things like that too. Next slide, please. In our archives department, of course, that has to do with a lot of paper materials, microfilm, digital, just different media. And so this is where people can come in even to our Pathways room, which is our research room, and you know, study what our archives department and our collections offers. So it's it's basically 1/2 of our entire collections is just the archives itself. I know we're running out of time, so I'll try to keep the next one short. Next slide, please. And our collections, as we mentioned. So one thing that the museum didn't do in the past was there wasn't a space or a staff capability to work on conservation of some of those items. I mean, much was done that could be done given the resources and time and staff to help conserve a lot of the materials. And but now we have someone on staff who helps with the conservation of our important materials in our collections. And our collections manager has also been with us for a long time, so she's a great resource as well. Next slide, please. And repatriation. So one of the challenges that our people have had in the past is, in terms of repatriation, is our old collections that I mentioned. It was down the street from the old museum. And so it wasn't, it didn't have the capabilities in terms of like HVAC and humidity controls to support certain culturally important items. Whereas now with this state-of-the-art building, we have all the capabilities and the security and all the resources to be able to have items such as this. So one of the things that the director has worked on with the president of the Seneca Nation and the council and the treasurer is repatriating some of these important culturally significant objects. The corn planter pipe tomahawk, which was at the New York State Museum when they repatriated back to the Seneca Nation of Indians, is housed here. And the red jacket piece medal, which I know this is a forum with the Buffalo area, probably familiar with that. That was at the Buffalo History Museum, and they, repatriated back to the Seneca Nation of Indians. And so those things are important to our Seneca people because they come from our ancestors, and a lot of us are related to those folks, but they're also symbols of commitments, right? So for these two particular objects, they're not necessarily, the property of the museum or the cultural center. These belong to the people, and that's why and how we got them through the efforts of the Seneca Nation. Next slide, please. And that's the conclusion. That says Nyawwe, and that means I'm thankful, or it can be used as a way to say, thank you. So.
Okay, Hayden, thank you. It's here in the Buffalo area, Buffalo Niagara Falls area, we tend to know Senecas by way of casinos. And my question really is, do you have a traveling exhibit capability that I always see those parking lots filled, and I've often thought that what a great way to tell the story of the museum if you did have some sample from your collection to really entice people to want to go down and see the entire museum. Is that something you do or have thought of doing?
Yeah, we've done that in the past. We don't necessarily have something set aside or created where we kind of just move it here and there. If there's a need for something like that, the museum in the past has certainly created what would fit in for what venue it was in. I know that the museum used to have a traveling exhibit that went to the the Erie County Fair at the Nyawwe Village there, and other places. We've done stuff at the Allegheny State Park, which is right down the road, at their visitor center. So yeah, but in terms of having one just ready to go, we don't have anything like that. We try to tailor it to whatever space and whoever's sort of requesting it.
Well, that's good. And you, in the introduction, mentioned specialty artwork that you do. Is the background that I'm looking at behind you, is that some of your work, or can you describe a little bit of what I'm looking at?
Yeah, those are a sample of some earrings that I made. Those were made to honor the children of the residential boarding schools. And so what I did is I used those to do a photography series on my social media accounts about the Thomas Indian School, which was actually on one of our territories. And I did some photographs there, and then it turned into a whole other big project about the Thomas Indian School. So yeah, those are just an example of some earrings that I make. But I make elaborate necklaces and some sculptures, all using antler and bone as the material.
Well, there's a story behind the school in just a couple minutes. Could you just give that overview of the school and how it's seen today, and how it does encourage or inspire artwork that you've put together? There's some meaning behind the images that I'm looking at. Yeah.
Well, the story actually begins up in the Buffalo Creek area, West Seneca area too. So that's where the story actually begins, because that's where the founders of the Thomas Asylum and Destitute Orphan Children, which later became the Thomas Indian School, they were Presbyterian missionaries up there in that area. And then they came down to our Cattaraugus territory and started their missionary work down there. And then in what they deemed as a need to rescue, as they say, impoverished, neglected, and orphaned children on our Cattaraugus territory, they started this taking children into their mission house. And the mission house building still stands today on our territory. And that's one of those places that I shot that photography shoot with those earrings on one of our Seneca women using a model. So that's where it all started. And it officially started in 1855. right? And then eventually it transitioned into the Thomas Indian School once it came under the charter of the New York State education system. And so that's a little bit different too about it, is a lot of those residential boarding schools for Native people were federal initiatives. This one was under the state control. It closed in 1957. A few of those brick buildings from the Thomas Indian School still stand. And again, those were some of the areas I shot those photographs at. And so the idea for that project with the photographs and the story and what our people are focusing nowadays is not just the traumas and the horrible things that happened in these schools, primarily the Thomas Indian School, but it's a focus on healing in our communities, right? So we acknowledge the things that have happened, but we have to understand how they affect us today. The traumas that are carried on through our generations, the loss of family by going to live in these residential boarding schools, the stripping of the cultural through assimilation initiatives set forth by the federal government, and a plethora of other issues, drug abuse, sexual abuse, all those things, and how they carried into our, we pass those things to our children through behaviors and even things like, I guess, epigenetics could be one. So now we want to efface those things because they were so hard to talk about for so long, and they still are for many people because there's still survivors to this day that are alive. But now we're focusing on revitalizing things like art, which is one of the things that got taken, dancing, songs, language, medicines, family, all that stuff. So our people are now trying to celebrate and grow and heal, and we can do those things by revitalizing all those things that we've sort of we're taking.
Well, Hayden, thank you. Leah, any questions from our audience?
We do not have any questions.
Interesting. I figured with that, this would provoke some. This is it's a beautiful museum. I had occasion to be down there just a couple of weeks ago as with many of the volunteers from Explore Buffalo. And it's a nice ride from Buffalo, short, a little over an hour and a half in that area, and accessible, and certainly worth going to. And that's why we'll have another program to follow up in February. Any other thoughts that you want to leave us with? We've got just a couple of minutes left, Hayden. Any, especially from an art standpoint, how you approach that school, the healing that you're talking about. What goes through the mind of an artist to leave something that's beneficial for yourself and all of us?
Yeah, well, art is just an aesthetic, right? But an aesthetic can open the door for conversation. So, like those earrings, for example, I presented those as they are in the photograph, and I did some other little, just photographs of the actual earrings on social media. And then I did that whole series visiting those different sites on our territory with one of our community members, and she was going through the sites and buildings, and I was photographing her, and she was, experiencing emotions as we were doing it. And so those, drew in an audience of people that, sort of wanted to learn more about it too, because that's the idea, right? To have art as a way to initiate conversations, and then that opens up a lot of other things. And it helps spread awareness, right?
Absolutely right. The development of dialogue and literally a lot of it seems during this whole COVID episode, we're having new awarenesses of issues that have been there, but suddenly are rising to the surface for awareness and conversation at many levels. Leah, if there's any questions, if not, we're going to begin to wrap up here then. Anything else?
No questions.
All right. And I can only encourage folks to, to explore this. This has been a perfect month. We had the Native representative from the Native American Services here in Buffalo last week. It was on WBFO. The next day, they did a nice piece on it based on our interviews. So I encourage folks to at least be mindful of the month, Native Heritage Month, and certainly worthy of reflection and awareness. There's a lot of wisdom that comes out of the documents that the Confederation, Iroquois Confederation, put together. Invite folks to check out the Smithsonian Institute's website that makes direct links with our Constitution and the observers to the Iroquois Confederation and how they gathered together as we were writing our Declaration of Independence and Constitution. So I think folks will find it most interesting to do so. So that's my encouragement for the day and the month. Hayden, thank you very much. We're going to skip a week for Thanksgiving next week. And on the 30th, we'll be doing, there's 5 Tuesdays in the month of November. So we flip over to our Art of Investing, and we'll be exploring why what's called ESG or sustainable investing matters. And we'll have different folks that are involved in that field discussing just how investors of any sort, individuals, trustees that represent organizations, how they should begin to understand it, because it's evolving in our understanding, but it's literally trillions of dollars that are moving in this direction in the private sector as literally the planet starts to discuss the whole area of sustainability. And in part, that's why the Native American experience is so interesting, because there's a degree of understanding of living in harmony with Mother Earth. Certainly that is in the culture of Native American and its heritage. So I'm Dennis Galecki, wishing everyone a wonderful Thanksgiving, much to be thankful for. Certainly we're thankful for all the support and help the library puts together, folks like Leah, her colleague Melissa, and Joy, and the library staff, and especially folks for you tuning in. Thank you for supporting this program and making it an enjoyable volunteer experience from my standpoint. So I'm Dennis Galecki. Hayden, thanks again. And thanks everybody. Happy Thanksgiving.
No,